Thank you everyone for joining us today for part of our conference series on When Home is Where the Hurt Is. We're delighted today to have Ceryl Davies with us from Bangor University. Ceryl is going to talk to us about young women's experiences of sexual coercion. Ceryl is a qualified social worker and a social work lecturer at Bangor University and has experience across social care, criminal justice, education, but is particularly interested in young people's intimate relationships, domestic abuse, and continuums of violence and abusive behaviour, which is the area that she's going to speak to us about today. We will be welcoming questions throughout the webinar. If you just type those in the chat, then it means that when we get to the end of the presentation, I'll be able to pass on those questions and we'll have a Q&A at the end. And otherwise, I think we're all set to go. If you'd like to try sharing, Ceryl.
That's lovely. Thanks for everyone's patience. And thank you for the invitation to be here with you today to discuss my research project, which is a research project very much close to my heart. So I'm looking forward to discussing this with you today and then accepting your questions. Thank you, everyone. Next slide, please. So the aim of this session is to identify the nature of abuse in young women's intimate relationships, outline the nature of the problem, give you a sense of a research project that I led on in North Wales, and including highlighting the importance of giving young women empowerment, active agency to be part of what's often regarded as sensitive research. And I'm going to evaluate the findings from the research with you and offer some form of solution with a practice model that I'm developing at the moment, which is a whole community approach to addressing abuse within young people's intimate relationships. Next slide, please. So the structure of this session will start off by giving you a sense of the nature of this problem, naming the issue and really outlining the social policy context, some of the research, the signs and symptoms of this form of abuse as well. Then I'll be moving on by discussing some of the research discussion, giving you a flavour of some of the findings from each stage of the research, and then finalising the session with a focus on the solutions and some of the solutions that I see as potential options for really addressing this social problem moving forward. Next slide. So just as a pause for thought, just in your back of your mind as I'm starting this presentation with you, I'm really interested if you just kind of evaluate your own reflections on how do you see young people's intimate relationships, and do you see abuse within young people's intimate relationships and adult relationships? Do you see the same or do you see it different with regards to the nature of the abuse but also the impact of the abuse? And what are your preconceived ideas with regards to young people's intimate relationships? So I just want you just to have those reflections at the start of this webinar, and then at the end I'd quite like for you just to kind of reflect on where you've reached and whether or not anything that we've discussed during this session has maybe reshaped any of your ideas around young people's experiences of intimate relationships. Next slide, please. So just to give you a flavour of the research, and this research project specifically, the aim of this research was to really focus on two elements of young people's intimate relationships. It was focused on really evaluating the attitudes towards intimate relationships, what was healthy, what was unhealthy within intimate relationships, and also to evaluate experiences. And this was all completed from young women's perspectives. And for me, what was really important about this research was to create a young women's only space for this research with young women across 7 secondary schools and the youth justice services in North Wales. And I focused this research on young women aged from 15 to 18 years old. And the research was separated into 3 key stages. The first key stage was around having an advisory group with young women, which I'll explain a bit further in a moment. For me, it was really, really important to co-produce this research with young women and for them to advise me at each stage of the research. Because as I explained to them, unless I have an amazing time machine or an amazing face cream, I'm not 15, I'm not 16, I'm not 17 or 18 having an intimate relationship at the moment. So for me, just to have that authenticity and that real understanding of what intimate relationships both online and offline are for young women at the moment, I wanted that advice at each stage of the research from young women that I worked closely with. And then the second stage of this research was the questionnaires, and I had a sample of 220 questionnaires across the 7 schools and the Youth Justice Services in North Wales. And the aim of these questionnaires was to really explore the attitudes, young women's attitudes towards gender norms, social media, and the spectrum of abuse across relationships, both healthy aspects of relationships, but also those unhealthy aspects of abusive behaviour. And for me, one thing that I really wanted to unpick and explore within this research was really getting a sense of these attitudes to everyday social norms and how these everyday social norms then impacted on the level of power that young women had or didn't have to really shape their intimate relationships and choices. And then the final stage of the research was completing 25 semi-structured questionnaires with young women from the sample schools that I worked with and the Youth Justice Services to really gain a sense of their everyday experiences of intimate relationships and also abuse. And I'll give you a sense as we're going through the presentation of how stage 2 and stage 3 of this research really linked together quite interestingly to really shape the findings of this research. So next slide. So just to give you a bit of context of where my interest really came about with regards to this research. So historically, as Hannah mentioned at the beginning, I've worked as a social worker for over 20 years in England and in North Wales. And as part of one of my roles, I worked as a senior manager for Youth Justice Services in North Wales. And as part of this role, I developed group work around well-being and relationships for young women and young people. And I think my interest really came about from really developing those services and developing interventions and group work for young people, really on this specific topic. But also during the time when my interest in this topic was really developing, the UK definition at the time, which was non-statutory, of domestic violence and abuse at the time, and the UK definition from the Home Office at the time really was the first step forward in really including young people as part of that definition of domestic violence and abuse from that age of 16 to 18. And I think that really, really shaped my interest in this topic, because for me, we didn't have that statutory definition of domestic abuse. We weren't really including young people as part of that definition, but a lot of the emerging evidence at the time was really reflecting that young people, and specifically young women, were the group most at risk of domestic abuse. So for me, the conversation really needed to change with regards to our understanding of not just abuse within young people's intimate relationships, but also their experiences of gender, their experiences of the continuum of abusive behaviour within their intimate relationships. And then obviously with time now, we've had the Serious Crimes Act, which has introduced a statutory definition of coercive controlling behaviour. And then recently now we've had the Domestic Abuse Act, which has given us a statutory definition of domestic abuse and includes young people 16 to 18 as part of that statutory definition. But for me, even though there was interest and policy debates around this topic, there was still limited research around the everyday occurrences and acceptability of abuse, the everyday understanding of that continuum of abusive behaviour within intimate relationships. So what I really wanted to do as part of this research was really exploring with young people, yes, the attitudes towards intimate relationships, but also really unpicking right from that starting point of when you're really gathering that interest in someone, where you're having the chats or the discussion, or you're talking to someone or dating someone, where does the power lie? And how does that power shift or change right from the beginning of that relationship, linking it with courtship or dating norms, and then looking at how that links with a continuum of abusive behaviour within these relationships. Next slide, please. And then when I was looking at the nature of this problem, which has changed significantly over the last 10 years, around our understanding of abuse within young people's relationships, what the nature of the problem was illustrating was when we're looking at the severity and the frequency and the range of impact of abuse within young people's intimate relationships, the impact of young women is far more severe than it is on young men. And when we've looked at some data, some research which has shown a degree of parity, when you're really looking at the nature of the data and the nature of the abuse, as I mentioned, the frequency and the severity is much more severe on young women. So for me, that was my rationale for really pushing this research forward to be a young women only space for gathering their attitudes and experiences. And what we know now from recent data is that 86% of young women are now reporting being sexually harassed within public spaces. So understanding that continuum of abusive behaviour, you know, that linked with harassment and catcalling within public spaces, and then how that then translates into private intimate relationships, was very important to me. And then links with the recent school review in England, and also some of the new data that we've got from the NSPCC report, which is illustrating that just within a space of a couple of months, they were getting 350 calls to their helpline of young women reporting being harassed and abused within schools. So for me as well, completing research within the school arena and also the wider community was very important. Next slide, please. And then when we're looking at naming the issue as well, as I've mentioned, for me, that link between the attitudes and the experiences was very important, because a lot of the research that had been completed in schools with both young women and young men often illustrated that abuse was often excused or justified by young people based on excuses like, well, it's okay for you to be abusive towards your boyfriend, girlfriend, if he or she has cheated. So a lot of the abuse was often being excused by young people, and I really wanted to unpick that further as part of this research. But also, as I've mentioned, I really wanted to unpick some of the risk factors around the severity and the degree of the abuse, but also I really wanted to unpick as well the nature of the online and offline abuse. Next slide. So moving forward to the actual research, and just to give you a flavour of the first phase of the research. So as I mentioned, for me, it was very important that I included young women as part of the co-research design of all the tools within the research. And I established two groups in separate schools in North Wales. The focus and the role of group one was to advise me on the questionnaire, the vignettes, the language and the translation, with then the aim of the second group was to review all the drafts, all the scales, and to pre and post test all the tools that I use. And I have to say, I absolutely loved this stage of the research. I worked with the schools for nearly a whole school year to co-produce everything in partnership with the young women, got to know the young women very well, would often stay and have lunch with them, and really enjoyed developing that relationship, which gave me an insight into their everyday experiences of being young women in school and within their communities. But they advised me, and they would often, they got quite savvy with how they developed that relationship with me, and they would get their pen out, they would say, oh, shall I mark this for you, Ceryl? And really kind of commented on all my scales, all my stories and vignettes and the language. And some of the advice they gave me was invaluable. So for example, they told me that my translation of the tools was too formal. you know, which then meant that I could adjust and have some of the language and terminology that was okay for them. So that really shaped the translation of all the tools. But also with the vignettes, you know, I'd written all the vignettes and then shared them to have comments with the young women. And they would often say, you know, one vignette I wrote was around young people being in a party. And I think I'd kind of written in the vignette that they were drinking vodka in the party. And they said, we don't drink vodka when we go to parties. We drink WKD or we drink Alka-Pops. So they really kind of commented on everything and made sure that I was bringing their voices into the tools that I was using, getting it right, hopefully at that stage, and having as much, you know, critical friends that I could to really shape the research process. So that was a really invaluable part of this process and the co-production of the research design. And also because the nature of this research is potentially very sensitive, for me, it was really important that I understood what it was like for them now to have the online and the offline kind of environments for dating. And I kind of really learned quite a lot about the dating culture at the moment, around the fact that you're talking with people through virtual kind of platforms for a while, and then you're developing that progression to the relationships. So for me, that understanding was invaluable. Next slide, please. And I used different tools with them. We created different word clouds, and all of the word clouds are all of the kind of different tools that I took to participate and include them as part of the research design. Really, as I've mentioned, inform the development of all the tools. And I took on all their comments, and if I wasn't able to take a comment onwards, I would let them know so that they understood the rationale for accepting and maybe not accepting some of their comments. But from my recollection, I think their comments were spot on, and I often had that light bulb moment of thinking, oh God, yeah, I should really change that and adapt it, you know, as they're kind of advising me. Next slide. And this is an example of the vignette that they co-produced with me. And we included several vignettes as part of both the questionnaire and also as part of the interview process. And they really shaped the stories with me, so that voice, that kind of authenticity of their experiences was coming into the vignettes that I was shaping in partnership with them. Next slide. So just giving you a sense, before I'm moving on to the discussion on the themes, I'm just going to give you a sense of who the participants were as part of the project. So as I mentioned, I worked in partnership with seven schools in North Wales and the Youth Justice Services, and it was a mixture of schools from both urban and also rural areas. The participants were mixed across year 10 to year 13, to a really small group not being in school. And that was really important for me, to include schools primarily, but also to access those young women who, for whatever reason, were not in school or education or employment. I measured the eligibility of school meals just to get that real sense of the demographic of the group. And as you can see there, there was quite that mix between eligible school meals and non-school meals. The ethnicity was as you would imagine from the North Wales demographic, higher percentage of white UK, but that is in keeping with the demographics of North Wales. The main language at home was split 50-50 between Welsh and English. But interestingly, whilst a lot of the young people were choosing to complete the questionnaire through the medium of English, 17 of the young women who were interviewed chose to have their interviews through Welsh. So actually, when they were having that conversation and when they were discussing their really quite sensitive experiences of intimate relationship and also often abuse, they wanted to talk in Welsh and they wanted to have that choice. So I think for me, that really reiterated the importance of an active offer of Welsh language. And then from the sample, 60% of the sample had gone out with someone, so they had that intimate relationship experience, and 30 of the sample were currently in that intimate relationship. For me, I wanted to include the young women who wanted to be part of the interviews, and I had a significant amount of young women, and I did a random sample from the young women who had come forward to want to be interviewed. It was over 100 young women. So for me, it wasn't really that point of, are they in a relationship now, or have they got that intimate relationship experience? Because for me, it was also that observation of the gendered social norms, the level of equality, and also what they were observing from their peer groups, from their intimate relationship experience observation, and also their own intimate relationship experience. Next slide, please. So before I'm moving on to discussing the themes, it's really, really important that I'm really highlighting the dominance of social media. So for me, from the outset, from really stepping into the schools, there was no doubt that the dominance of social media in shaping young people's worlds, young people's attitudes, experiences, and intimate relationships was overwhelming. And at the start of both the advisory groups and the separate schools, I did an exercise with them around the desert island exercise, just like an icebreaker of, you know, if I was this amazing person who could put a yacht outside their school and take them off to one of the lovely, you know, islands in the Caribbean, you know, what would the 3 things that they would take with them if there was only 3 things? And overwhelmingly across all the schools and both the advisory groups, the young women would say, I'm taking my phone, I'm taking Wi-Fi, and I'm taking my charger. So not only were they taking their phone, but they were using all their options to kind of really make sure that they were on Wi-Fi and they could charge their phone. So for me, right from that start, their lives and how their lives are really kind of conducted on social media was quite a key aspect of this research. And then when I was kind of really discussing with the sample group, 90% of the sample group had a mobile phone with the internet. They were really using Facebook and Snapchat, and their usage of Facebook, Snapchat, and other platforms like Instagram changed with blocks of their age, right from the 15, 16, 16, 17 to 17, 18. So their use of, for example, Facebook really changed as they grew older, as is the same with Snapchat and Instagram. But also when I was discussing with them what was okay and not okay online, they were really discussing that sexting without permission. They were saying that's wrong. Rating appearance, they were saying, no, yep, we don't agree with rating physical appearance online. So they were quite savvy, and their attitudes that they were really illustrating with what's okay and not okay online was there. Okay, but I'll come back to that key point later around them sharing healthy attitudes, because as I'll illustrate later, that changed. Next slide, please. So when we were discussing attitudes to gender norms, as was the case really with discussing what was okay online, overwhelmingly the group could say quite clear, right from the advisory group and their views, right through to the actual research sample group, they could say, well, actually, you know, I feel savvy. I feel that we're equal. I feel that we've got strong equality with regards to parity, young women, young men. Okay, that was a clear message that was coming through from all the data that I gathered from the questionnaire. Okay, so they were able to really disagree with clear statements that really challenged some of those gendered social norms around equality. Okay, however, what was interesting from the data is when I began to really unpick some of those gendered social norms within intimate relationships, some of those attitudes of what they perceived to be equal attitudes were beginning to kind of really disappear and were beginning to be challenged. So for example, when I questioned if, for example, there on a date, boys should be expected to pay for everything, 52%, so just over half of the sample, strongly disagreed. Okay, so they were really, when they were beginning to unpick some of these dating norms, what I began to see from the data was they were beginning to revert back to some of these gendered social norms around what's expected of a young woman traditionally and what's expected of a young man within those traditional dating scripts. And that was something that was really interesting emerging from the data when I was beginning to explore their attitudes. So when I was unpicking with them around their attitude, what's okay, what's not okay within intimate relationships, what's abusive behavior, what they thought was healthy, what they thought was unhealthy, they were really beginning to able to say quite clearly what they thought was a healthy relationship and what they thought was an unhealthy relationship. So actually, if I asked them to describe to me the signs and symptoms of abuse, what a healthy relationship looked like and what an unhealthy relationship looked like, they could clearly articulate that. If I asked them to tell me where they would go for support, you know, which professionals, which websites, you know, where would they access the support, they could clearly tell me. They had all the information. So for me, this was really quite telling for two key aspects, okay? One, young people have the information around healthy and unhealthy relationships. So for me, going into schools and giving them that information, they already have the information. That is not the issue. They understand the signs and symptoms of abuse. They understand what that relationship, which is unhealthy and unhealthy, looks like, okay? So that was one key finding. The second key finding was, and I'll discuss this now when I'm going to discuss the themes from the interviews, was they could tell me, as I mentioned, what equality looks like. They could actually tell me that they feel equal, that they feel that they've got a strong equal standing within their school, within their community. However, when we were discussing the power and the power balance within intimate relationships, the young women reverted back to gendered social norms, okay? And their really power or their articulation of that kind of equality within relationships further disappeared when I was discussing their actual relationship experiences, okay? So what this indicated to me was they can tell me what equality looks like. They can tell me what a healthy attitude looks like. However, they can't and they couldn't illustrate that they could operationalize that within their own intimate relationships. And I'll give you some examples of that now as I'm moving on to discuss the themes from the interviews and their own intimate experiences. And for me, that was why this methodology of really combining that quantitative stage of the interviews and the attitudes gathered from the interviews and then really looking at how that translated into their intimate relationships was something quite central here. So when I was looking at young women's aspirations around relationships, what was beginning to become very apparent was their emotion work, okay? And what I mean by that is that they were basically wearing what I'm calling an egalitarian mask. So they were putting this mask on and presenting their standing within school, community relationships as being equal. Okay. However, when I was beginning to unpick the balance and the relationship choices, they were really putting on this mask and doing this emotion work of really hiding their true feelings and really trying to follow social norms or what they thought was the right girlfriend role, okay? Or what they thought young men wanted from relationships. So they were really discussing what they thought was attractive as being big boobs, shapely bum, and a slender waist, okay? That's what boys want. So that's what we should do as young women. We should really fit into this mode and this model of looking in that way and having this attraction measured, not just by your physical appearance of what they thought was desirable by young men. However, they also measured this attraction by your ability to be in an intimate relationship. So if you weren't in an intimate relationship, they kind of described you were then out of the conversation. So, for example, one participant, Claire, and that's a pseudonym. All the names here are pseudonym that the young women chose for themselves. So there's no real names shared here. But what Claire was describing was, she was saying there's 10 of us in our group, 10 of us in our gang. 8 of us have had boyfriends, we've had sex, we're in a relationship, so we're in it, we're in the conversation. The other 2 who haven't are a bit out of that conversation now. So they were beginning to illustrate this idea of, for you to be successful, you need to have that girlfriend status mode and you need to begin to be passive. Okay, so you need to, for you to feel special or to make the boy feel special or be together, you need to be passive. So this emotion work was beginning to be apparent around the passivity that young women thought was expected for them or by young men, for them to be that successful girlfriend role, because the consequences of not being that successful girlfriend was not being wanted, being out of the conversation, or being on the shelf. Okay, and this was how they were describing it. And then they were then also reverting to really gendered social norms around explaining, if you're really kind of making that first move or showing your aspirations for more of an exclusive relationship, then you were getting into what they called psycho girlfriend mode. So, you can't push the conversation to really have that check around what is the relationship status, because you're then kind of really getting on the boy's nerves, or you're being crazy and you're being weird. So what was interesting here, when I was taking that step back with them and having that conversation, not necessarily about the abuse that they were experiencing, but really taking those steps back and really exploring those dating scripts and those dating social norms, all of that control and that kind of really gendered divide was there from the outset of them really describing the nature of their relationships. Next slide, please. So they were doing that relationship, what they called the status check, okay? And they felt, well, boys feel trapped in a relationship, they're laid back, so I don't want to nag them, so because it's kind of annoying, yeah? And they then really translated this, not just from that relationship check or that exclusivity check, is it just us? Are we together? Are we going out, kind of thing? They were saying, well, actually, when we're then discussing this within the concept of how that kind of intimacy developed, and that intimacy developed into who was the instigator of sexual contact, sexual intercourse, they were saying, well, boys plan. So we have to have sex, and then if we don't have sex, they'll sulk. And that was Ellen describing how that relationship progressed, saying, well, sometimes I have to have sex with him because I know if I don't, he'll just sulk. And this was her boyfriend of a couple of years. And she often felt pressurized to have sex with him, even if she really didn't want to. But what was also interesting was this idea of, well, this idea of, well, they'll make the first move. And, Michelle was describing around the boy that she wanted a relationship with, but he didn't want a long-term relationship, but she kind of saw him, and what she would describe, she would cop off with him. And what she described was, he's tried a few times to have sex with me. I've backed off and said, I don't want to have sex. And then he tries again. And I thought, oh, do you know what? It's fair enough. I'll have sex with him this time. So this sexual coercion was there, and something that the young women felt, well, this is the role I need to play. So, I will have sex with him even if I don't want to. So what was creeping in here was this discussion around sexual coercion and this confusion, which was really worrying around consent. And what a lot of the young women were discussing with me was this urgency to have sex, okay? But the urgency to have sex wasn't just the key finding here, because when I went in to do the interviews with the young women, I went in with the interview schedule, which was really building up the discussion, right from who made the choice, around how did you start dating, who initiated the chat online or face-to-face, who made the decision of where you went on your first date. But for me, even though I was building up that interview to focus on the progression of their intimate relationship, all the young women were really going in straight away at the start of the interview wanting to discuss sex and their sex life, okay? And for me, what a lot of the young women were telling me is we don't have a safe space to discuss some of the key questions that we have around sex and what's okay and not okay. And what they were discussing was, I'm not clear, this is what they were saying, if once I've had sex with a boy, does that mean I always have to have sex? Have I then crossed that line into having regular sex, or can I take that step back and then make the choice for not to have sex? So a key finding here was not just this element of the progression of intimate relationship, but actually the challenges that young women have in navigating intimate relationships and that uncharted territory, and that they wanted that sounding board and someone that they could chat with to discuss some of the concerns that they have around intimate relationships, but also sex and consent and sexual coercion. Next slide, please. And then I'll discuss with you now the second theme, which is focused on sexual double standards. Next slide. So one of the key things that was really quite overt as well was not just how the young women were negotiating their gendered identities within their intimate relationships, but also how they were often judged around performing their gendered role within schools and within the community, and how that was often very linked with sexual coercion and sexual harassment and catcalling, and also how they were often judged for their sexuality or their feminine role or how they looked. Okay, and there's a quote from Glein there, you know, illustrating, if you're thin, you're okay, if you're not, they call you a pig. And they were also describing how some of the rules and the boundaries within the schools was affecting this. So, for example, there was this rule within several of the schools that if they wore a certain amount of makeup, then they would have the wet wipe across their face in the classroom to remove their makeup. And they often felt that their sexuality, how they looked, was being judged, not just within the school, but within their community. So for me, the idea of gender, sexuality and coercion was there throughout their spaces, both public and also their private spaces. Next slide. And then this idea of the sexual double standards, when I was going through all the interviews, unfortunately, the word that was coming up the most across all the interviews was sluts and slags as well, okay? And this was the young women described how they were often judged. So if they were having sex, they were a slut. If they weren't having sex, then they were judged as being frigid. So they were often negotiating these very tight road of a double sexual standards, where they were judged for having sex, but actually boys talked quite openly in schools and also within the classroom environment, but also online, around rating sexual experiences, or what they would see as sexual conquests, but also rating the appearance of young women online and also within the classroom. And this idea of being judged, oh, look at them, big sluts, and you know, this idea of what Grieg was saying, girls get called names like slag and sluts, but nothing happens to boys. It's easier for boys to sleep around. They get called a lad, girls get called sluts. So this idea of how this then shaped the pressure that they had within the environments around sexual coercion. Next slide, please. And then just exploring the third and final theme, I'm just aware of time as well. So the nature and patterns of abuse. So what's that kind of attitudes, but also the build-up of the relationships are really translating to these young women then who had been or were in a longer term relationship. They were just feeling this pressure. So I had to have sex, reserved to having sex after 7 months. I basically have to do sex acts. It's what makes him happy. And Jennifer was 18 and she'd been with her boyfriend for just over a year. And she really was describing to me how upset she was because their sex life was often discussed very openly without her consent within the sixth form room. And he was discussing things that she felt uncomfortable with, like the fact that he wanted to watch porn and he wanted to have a threesome, and he was discussing all of their intimate details openly within the sixth form room and placing that sexual coercion then through his peer groups, and this idea as well of being in a mood and being in sulk if that kind of sex wasn't on the agenda or something that was the choice of the young woman. And then this justification of it's okay because he likes planning, so he decides. So this justification as well within the narratives and experience of intimate relationships of some of the abusive and sexual coercion. Next slide. And as I mentioned, social media, and I could do a whole session just on the social media, but not just the surveillance through social media, tracking movements through social media. There was also, again, this gender divide. The young men within the schools often had Facebook pages called the Lads, which were rating sexual conquests and sharing photos of young women. Also, a lot of the young women were describing how they frequently, and I mean every day, would have frequent requests from nudies from some of their peers, but also from men that they'd never met. Okay, so this was a frequent, regular thing, part of their life, and something that the young women often laughed about, saying, "Yeah, we get nudie requests. It's like the norm." And this idea as well of this last point here around shaming and female sexual desire within one of the schools that I worked in for over a year. And I'll just briefly describe this example. One young woman had shared a video of herself masturbating with a close, well, someone who she trusted and who she was close with. Unfortunately, that video then was shared not just across the school, but across the community. She was then judged, shamed, ostracized, labeled, and this was for months. Okay, in light of that video, this was something that significantly impacted on her life. For the within this same school, a young man had done something similar, and he was off school and well for a week, and then came back, and everyone laughed about it, and it was a joke, and it was like, oh yeah, a bit of a banter. That's how they described it. So for me, it wasn't just the gender divide within their relationships, it was that gender divide around how young women are shamed and stigmatized differently, and how we also see female and male pleasure differently. Next slide. And then, yes, the other key term that was coming up frequently within the interviews was not just slag and slut, which obviously are very derogatory terms and really shaped their experiences, but also his mood. Okay, and how his mood would often shape what the young women thought was expected from them to be a successful girlfriend. Next slide. So just to summarize, there's this idea of the young women really contextualizing their experiences and really placing it down to gender. And actually what was being described right from their attitudes and their inability to operationalize their attitudes into their everyday experiences of intimate relationship was this framework of male dominance, which I'm not for 1 minute saying that all young men want this dominance and masculinity. I think there are equal pressures on young men to be masculine, okay, when they possibly don't want to be in that hyper masculine role. But what was being shown here was that this framework of really social norms and male dominance, and this complete kind of dependence on really putting themselves down and saying, well, girls are more emotional, I was being a typical girl thing. That was Becky saying because she challenged her boyfriend being abusive. This idea from Aisha, I was being psychotic girlfriend mode, because she challenged her older boyfriend who was abusive with her. And this pressure that they were saying that young men often have on this pressure also to have sex and to do it, to lose their virginity. So yes, I acknowledge that there's also pressures on young men to perform this masculine role, and this idea that they have no shame, it's just a boy thing. So again, justification, excusing this behavior. Next slide. And this escalation, and the escalation of these long-term relationships then was this escalation into physical violence and physical abuse. So this element, and there's lots of examples from the research around emotional, verbal abuse, sexual coercion, but also this escalation then into physical violence. So all of that continuum abusive behavior was there throughout the relationship narratives. Next slide. And the peer influence was there. And one thing that's a significant finding from this research, in my view, was this idea that whilst we know from research within adult intimate relationships that abuse is often hidden and not discussed, what was very clear from the research that I completed and the key finding was that the abuse was something that was very visible online, very visible face-to-face within the community and also within the classroom, and also outside the classroom in the school community. It wasn't something that was hidden, okay? It was something that was often completed in the sixth form room, in front of other peers, and there was often quite a level of public humiliation. So also what we need to target when we're looking at prevention is not just looking at the attitudes and then how we're giving young women power to have more power within intimate relationships, but also actually this is not hidden, it's very visible. So it's not about educating young people about healthy relationships or unhealthy relationship. It's about really challenging their justification, their excuses, and also really giving that sense of that power divide. Next slide. So just to summarise, so abuse within young people's intimate relationships was overtly displayed, not hidden at all. It was there across several of the intimate relationships, but also is something that I obviously observed across the schools that I worked with. There were several barriers for young women to access support. What young women were telling me was that they wanted to have that access to confidential support, to ask questions about sex, what was okay and what wasn't okay. They didn't want to go to the school nurse, because if they were queuing in the queue outside the school nurse room, they would then be judged as being pregnant or having another issue. Okay, they didn't want to also go and talk with the deputy head or the school lead safeguarding lead, because also that would be often the deputy head. Okay, there was this sense as well that young women often justified abuse by saying that they provoked it themselves. So actually, when they were saying that they have healthy attitudes, they were then using some of the gender norms to excuse some of the abusive behaviour. And what the young women were saying is, we need to be empowered to say no to sex, no to pictures, and also to really learn how to keep our sex lives private. Next slide, please. And then what time, and I'm just aware of time, sorry, I know I've haven't timed this very well, apologies everyone, but within a new publication that I've got now is I'm really looking at a whole community approach. A lot of the interventions today are focused on a whole school approach. For me, it needs to go beyond the whole school. It needs to be a whole community approach around really addressing this as a social problem, but also looking at how we can have a multi-agency response to addressing this issue. Next slide. Can we move to the next slide after that? Sorry. And then this is my kind of outline around what should be included as part of a healthy relationship, which is also included in the publication I've got coming out quite soon, which will hopefully include a toolkit around looking at this issue within intimate relationships for young people, with a toolkit and a practitioner guide. So this is my outline. I think for me, any form of healthy relationship education needs to start with gender, how we do gender, the nature of the problem, and then looking at kind of support, both formal and informal. Next slide. So concluding thoughts, really, lack of support, education and prevention still, even though we have shifted quite a lot around the work that's happening now, I think we still have a lot of time to go and a lot of way to go around really addressing this issue across the sexual double standards. I also looked at pleasure and desire within the young people's intimate relationships, and also love. And within a publication I've got coming out, I do also explore love, because for me, this research was beyond just looking at abuse. It was looking at dating scripts, norms and gender within young people's intimate relationships. But for me, it's about empowering young people to really have that confidentiality and space and power to talk about intimate relationships, but also to have that empowerment to operationalize what they know. They have the facts, they have the knowledge, they have the healthy attitudes. It's about really giving them power to really operationalize this, but also it's about changing that gender divide, because for young women to have more power, we need to give the skills and we need to give the tools for young men to relinquish a degree of that power, which is part of the challenge. So next slide. So I'm going to end this now, and I'm sorry, I know I've gone over time slightly, with Glyne. And Glyne was a 15-year-old young woman who I worked with as part of the questionnaire and also as part of the interview, okay? And Glyne was savvy. She was savvy, and she could tell you everything about relationships, and she could tell you everything about what she felt was okay. And she described that she'd received a nudie request, and she'd received a nudie request from someone she didn't know, and she said, "Ugh, I'm not sending a picture of myself." So she went up to the bathroom, placed a sponge in the bath, took a picture, send him a nudie of SpongeBob and say, "There's your nudie, do one," kind of thing. And she was savvy, okay? Then she had, send me a proper nudie of you. So she went, peeled an apple, took a photo of the apple, said, "There's a nudie for you, an apple, do one," okay? So she could give me examples of how she dealt with these issues. However, what Glyne then described was, "But listen, Ceryl, I'm subtle. I'm always checking in with myself. I'm always making sure that I don't do this, I don't do that. I have respect, I think." And she was like nervous, and you could see it, because I don't do anything. I'm subtle, so I'm okay. So what she was describing, even though she was savvy and she could challenge the nudie requests, she was constantly checking in with herself and quite anxious with it, but putting herself in this cage around really monitoring her own behavior so she wouldn't be judged, shamed, stigmatized, and she would then make sure that she was navigating that really tightrope all the time to make sure she wasn't falling over one way or the next. So thank you very much, everyone. Next slide has some of my publications on, and I'm just working now on finalising my book, which will be out soon, and that will have the toolkit for the practitioners, which will be a free tool that will be available, which will discuss some of the issues today and the whole community approach that I discussed with you as the practice model, but also we'll also discuss love within intimate relationships and pleasure and desire, which is also very important. So thank you very much. I'm sorry that I've spoken forever. I should have said at the start that I'm very Welsh and that I talk for Wales as well. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening.
Thanks so much, Ceryl. That was absolutely fascinating. And I'm sure I can speak for many of us today. I'm sure we could hear you talk about this for another whole hour. You've clearly got some really, really rich experiences from young people and a lot to share. We've got a few questions which I'll try and get through quickly just before everyone has to head off. So we've had some questions about the participation of girls and young women in your research design. It was excellent to see that you had those focus groups and that support right the way through. Did their involvement affect the research questions as well as the design of the questionnaires?
Yeah, it really shaped the research right from the start, right to the findings and the discussions of the themes. And I worked with both advisory groups for a whole year. So I synchronized it with doing the research. So they developed with me. And in some of the schools as well, not with the sample group, obviously. I did do healthy relationship education as well with young people. So I loved it. It was fascinating. And it taught me about being a young woman now, some of the challenges that they face, and also how self-conscious I felt myself going in. And, you know, I went in on the first day with my box and my Tesco carrier bag with all my stuff in, and then realized that everyone now has like quite a lot of designer handbags in schools. So I felt really self-conscious, and it made me think, oh my God, I'm feeling peer pressure, you know. So it was just all fascinating. So they were part of the project right from the start, right to the finish.
Yeah, and we've had a few, so that was from Sally Holland. Sally's got another question, and I'm going to combine this with a few. So thank you, Angela and NJ and Catherine. Quite a few questions around kind of anything around those kind of heteronormative relationships. Were there any other examples? So were there examples of relationships where young women felt safe and empowered and had a kind of feminist understanding? What about gay relationships? Did you have any trans participants? And did you have any kind of information around maybe neurodiversity or any autistic young women within that? So what was the kind of diversity amongst the groups that you were working with?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. That's a really important question. So within the groups, there were young women who were curious about their sexuality, or who identified specifically as gay or lesbian or bisexual or curious. So there were those experiences that were shared, and also there were examples of vignettes. There weren't any participants that identified as trans, but they did explore quite a lot of experiences around pleasure, being in a healthy relationship, about love, and about sharing that power, and about how that progression of that dating script within that more balanced relationship. So there were also that discussion around sexual desire and pleasure, which was also something really important that I wanted to unpick, which will be discussed further in the book. But the diversity of the group really was what I would expect with regards to lots of rural schools within North Wales. But there was that higher percentage of young women who discussed their aspect of sexuality as being curious and wanted to explore that element further.
Yeah, excellent. I feel like we're just about out of time now, unfortunately. Sorry, I know there's a couple of things that we've not got to, and I'm sure it'll be excellent to hear more about your work and to be able to go and have a read of the book when it's out.
Yeah, no problem.
So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. And what I'm quite happy is if people wish to email me with any questions, or within this day and age of online, if anyone wants to meet over Teams and have a coffee and discuss anything, and maybe discuss, if you're a practitioner, some of the practitioner top tips and stuff in more detail, then I'm more than happy. You know, as someone's discussed my passion for this topic, 100%. This is my baby. This is my topic. More more than happy to discuss any element with anyone further. So please do feel free to ping me an email. My inbox is always open around a lot of these issues with young people's dating and also intimate relationships. So yeah, and abuse. So yeah, thank you.